today. And I make sure I have my highlighter selected so that when we get to the point where we're going to be highlighting some definitions, I'm ready to go. All right. Americans looked forward to a future of peace and prosperity. We have finished up Unit 4 talking about how people were working in the progressive era, trying to fix a lot of society's problems. We also talked about fighting World War I in Europe. And so we've spent a good, decade here really working hard at fixing all kinds of problems. After World War I in Europe, Americans come back eager for a new normal. Both President Warren G. Harding and then after him, Calvin Coolidge, turned our foreign policy back to isolationism, and we were focusing on growing America's economy through empowering businesses to grow with very little government regulation. In fact, Calvin Coolidge said Americans should work less for the government and more for themselves. Amen. Once we were no longer in wartime production, American factories were turning out more consumer goods than ever before. I'm going to highlight that word because we got to keep that in our minds. These consumer goods are things that make everyday life easier and more comfortable. The Roaring '20s is a decade of optimism. We have a hope for the future, fun, and increased freedom. American employment was up. The standard of living was rising. More Americans were optimistic. There's that optimism word again, and eager to enjoy a more modern lifestyle. As businesses grew, opportunities to invest in those businesses' stocks appealed to many hopeful Americans. Optimistic is also meaning hopeful. So more Americans began investing in the stock market. Originally, Americans had been thrifty. If you wanted to buy something, you saved up for that and then you bought it with cash. But in the 1920s, many companies began encouraging customers to buy goods like houses and cars using credit. Credit allows a person to borrow money to buy something and pay back the loan over time with interest. If the person doesn't repay the loan on time, though, the seller or the bank that loaned the money can reclaim or repossess the item. By 1929, though, 3 out of 4 cars are bought on credit, and many Americans were buying homes with loans as well. The business of America is business. All right, we're going to write down the definition or the term prosperity. It means improved living conditions that come with more economic stability and financial freedom. Let's highlight some words in this definition that help us to know the definition of prosperity. Improved living conditions, economic stability. I'm going to highlight financial freedom as well. The 1920s saw the transition from horse-drawn buggies to more and more people buying cars and automobiles. Until this point, most Americans couldn't afford to buy a car, but Henry Ford, as we talked about in Unit 4, was using the assembly line to mass produce his Model T cars in his Michigan factory. This method of production is more efficient, and it increased the number of cars that could be manufactured every day. More Americans could now afford to buy an automobile. Something that was once considered just a luxury became more common. More families actually had one of these cars. The trend is allowing more Americans to live outside cities and drive into work, so we have a growth of suburbs. It also is going to increase the demand for other industry jobs like steel, oil, rubber. All those things are going to be in higher demand when you have people buying cars that are made out of those things. So, growing prosperity. In our notes, we're going to say Americans were optimistic. There's that optimism word again. Many people investing in the stock market. The standard of living was rising. More Americans could afford automobiles. Homes were now, it was normal for many homes to just automatically have running water, flushing toilets, showers that worked, a kitchen with a faucet that ran clean water into the house, okay? And also having electricity in people's homes. Those used to be things that were only available to people who were really wealthy, and now we're seeing that more as, instead of a luxury item, it's more of a necessity, and more families have access to that. Here's an example of 1920s kitchen, which I think is kind of fun. They have this ice box over here. They have a stove. Okay, and this is their sideboard cabinet there. So it's kind of fun to see kitchens throughout different eras. Because of Thomas Edison's work with electricity, more cities and towns are installing electrical grids that brought electricity into people's homes and businesses. These new technologies made life easier for Americans and created a demand for what we call consumer goods that run on electricity. Inventions like the electric vacuum cleaner, washing machines, toasters, electric fans, all of them could be powered inexpensively with electricity. Factories started producing more and more of these consumer goods, and they were found within many middle-class American homes. Many of these inventions allowed housekeeping chores to be done much more quickly, which means women especially are going to end up having more time on what we call leisure activities, free time. They can read books, they can listen to the radio and listen to shows on the radio, they can listen to sports games, they can go to movies, which is kind of a new thing we'll be talking about here in a second. So let's define consumer goods. These are products intended for individual use by customers, such as cars, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners. Let's highlight some of the definitions here. Products, individual use, and I'm going to give an example. I'll highlight vacuum cleaners as my example. Okay. The 1920s is also nicknamed the Air Age, as Americans found more uses for airplanes. After World War I, many former military pilots bottled warplanes, then used them as crop dusters, stunt flyers, and flight instructors. In 1918, the post office began airmail services. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh, a pilot from here in Little Falls, Minnesota, was the first to fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. Amelia Earhart made similar transatlantic flights in 1928 and 1932. This helped promote the idea of air transportation. Pan American Airways will become the nation's first passenger airline in 1927. In 1886, Richard Sears started selling pocket watches by mail from his home in Minnesota. He then moved his business to Chicago and formed the Sears Roebuck and Company. Sears and other successful store owners like Marshall Fields attracted many customers in the 1920s. Department stores like Marshall Fields and Sears and Roebuck allowed customers to come to one place to get a variety of goods. Mail order catalogs, the most famous being Sears and Roebuck's, allowed rural Americans who didn't live near one of the big department stores to still be able to shop by placing orders that could be delivered to their doorstep. The middle class, it's kind of a new trend that happened because of all the jobs and opportunities that were created by some of those wealthy business and industrial tycoon leaders, okay, and the work that was done by the Progressive Era people to help those people who had been in poverty. We now start seeing a middle class, and they're benefiting from the increased availability of those consumer goods that we talked about, okay? So, modern conveniences like electricity being supplied to towns, factories mass-producing goods, department stores selling what we call consumer goods. People could order goods through catalogs. Like, here's consumer goods like a vacuum cleaner.
The score is 9-4 in favor of New York. This is the seventh inning in one of the wildest, woolliest games we've ever witnessed. There looks like a long punch into the bleachers for a home run. It is. Jonathan hitting one in the bleachers for a home run, scoring behind Owen.
The average income per person rose more than 35% during the 1920s, giving Americans more money to buy consumer goods, there it is again, and spend more time on leisure activities. We talked in Unit 4 about labor unions started by people like Samuel Gompers and Mother Mary Jones to help reduce the work week, have safer working conditions. We actually, in this era, now are seeing the fruits of all of that hard work, and people actually have shorter work weeks. We have a weekend where people don't have to work on the weekends on Saturdays and Sundays. So more people have more time for play. Popular leisure activities, including watching sports, including America's new pastime, baseball. Professional teams like the Dodgers and Yankees formed in cities. The invention of the radio brought sporting events into people's homes across America. Athletes like Babe Ruth, whose 60 home run record lasted for 34 years, and those are the people who become pop culture stars. So popular culture or pop culture are current culture trends shared through the media and aimed specifically for younger people. So we're going to highlight current culture trends, we're going to say through the media, and these are for specifically the younger people. Thomas Edison's motion picture camera expanded technologies and movie became popular. Films were silent, like you see here, and they had a live pianist at the time to accompany the picture. In 1927, the first talkie was introduced. Popular movie stars of the 20s include Charlie Chaplin and Anita Doris. Child labor restrictions and compulsory education laws meant that kids were going to school longer, which means that Americans are growing up more educated, which means that those educated people are going to be buying more magazines, reading more books, novels like Minnesota author F. Scott Fitzgerald in his popular book, The Great Gatsby. So the rise of pop culture gives us less time working means more time playing. Radios were bringing music and sports like baseball into homes. People reading more novels, motion pictures, movies, and their stars, like Charlie Chaplin here, became popular. This is all part of pop culture of the 20s. Okay, taking a watch of what's going on in this lady's imagination. She's dreaming about chopping her hair. Women found a new sense of freedom in the 1920s. New inventions like electricity and running water made housework easier. Families were smaller. Women going to colleges and schools and maybe even taking a job outside the home meant that couples were getting married a little later. Women were not quite getting married as like a 17, 18, 19-year-old young girl. Instead, they were putting that off a few more years, going out and kind of having fun, taking jobs outside the home, getting an education. We saw the decade start in the 1920s with women getting the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And now women are taking jobs outside the home. The decade is nicknamed the Roaring Twenties because for the first time, young people as a group started kind of rebelling against the values of the past and the authority of their parents. They wanted the fun and freedom of trying new fashions, attitudes, and even some risky behaviors like smoking and drinking bootleg alcohol and wild dancing to jazz music. Okay, this is the fashion of their parents from the progressive era. You see the long, heavy skirts, the high necklines, long sleeves. The skirts go all the way to their feet because it would be considered scandalous. Scandalous to show any part of your legs. But in the 1920s, bold new fashions and styles emerged. Men wore extra wide floppy pants and slicked down hair. Flapper women wore short dresses and short bobbed hairstyles and lots of makeup. The Charleston is a favorite dance involving wild flailing limbs. So you can see no longer do we have this super long dress. We have these short dresses and lots of legs showing, even ankles showing. Okay, smoking, wide flappy pants. All of those are new pop culture trends, fashion trends in the 1920s. Okay, we have a nickname for young women who were cutting their hair short, shortening their skirt lengths, taking jobs outside the homes, dancing the Charleston. Okay, we call them flappers. Okay, these are young women in the 1920s who challenged gender roles, cut their hair, and wore short, loose skirts. I'm going to say young women challenged gender roles, cut their hair. So, modern women were rejecting their mother's long, heavy clothing. Many cut their hair into a shorter, bobbed hairstyle. They challenged gender roles by learning to drive, going to college, and getting jobs. For many Americans, going to nightclubs provided a chance to drink illegal alcohol. The 18th Amendment banned the making, transporting, and sale of alcoholic beverages. As bars and liquor stores closed, thousands of illegal clubs called speakeasies sprang up. In many large cities, the police looked the other way as people continued to buy and sell alcohol. Making and selling alcohol, bootleg liquor, became a big business for people willing to work outside the law. Gangsters like Al Capone led organized crime rings based on supplying illegal alcohol to American cities. So we're going to define that as prohibition. We talked a little bit about prohibition in Unit 4. So we'll define that, the 18th Amendment and banned alcohol, and I'm going to say from 1920 to 1933, but it was not able to prevent the illegal speakeasies and the bootleg liquor and all the mafia crime that came out of that era. All right, and then we talked about the popular dance of the 1920s called the Charleston. You'll see why some of the parents thought it was really scandalous. The wild flailing limbs like that, showing a lot more skin than the mothers had with their longer dresses. see her dress flapping around. That's why they kind of get the nickname flappers.
Hot feet, stinging like a busy bee.
All right. Well, thanks for listening.